So, are you ready?
I'm ready for the Tor.
Okay.
Tor 2.0.
Yeah. So everything changed since we talked about it last. The way it used to work, real quick reminder, is it used to be purely a user anonymizing service, allowing people who wanted to access internet servers or services out on the public internet to do so without their IP and thus location, ISP, and potentially their identity being known. The way that was done was by hopping among a network of Tor nodes. Each node is a sort of a Tor server, and they are all interconnected. And the idea is that, we've all seen the sci-fi movies or actually not even science fiction anymore, where bad guys bounce around through multiple servers out on the internet and then finally make do whatever they're going to do. Often it's, on TV, they're making a phone call bouncing off of some satellites and things, which makes it difficult to figure out that they're actually next door. So what was so cool about this, the word Tor was an acronym originally, stands for the Onion Router. And it actually was a follow-on to an Onion Router network, which was the first thing created. And oddly, there's sort of some strange U.S. government entanglement here. I mean, even now, it's under the auspices of the Naval Research Lab. And it was originally created out of ARPA and DARPA.
Oh, now I'm suspicious.
Well, no, I think it's because we too need anonymity. I mean, wouldn't the NSA like to be able to do things and not have it traceable back to them? So, I mean, and so what we have is and Leo, it's all open source. I mean, everyone knows exactly what these Tor nodes are running. It's all done academically. I mean, so there's no way to be suspicious of this. It's that there are, it's not only individual users who want anonymity. It's the EFF has been a supporter of this, and the Free Software Foundation gave them an award a couple years ago for advancing the free social interests of technology on the internet to allow people in repressive governments to be able to have free speech. So there's a lot of good here. But to me, it's interesting that it was and still is, there's some governmental support behind this thing being developed, which I think is interesting.
General Petraeus should have used it.
The way it originally worked is a client would pick at random a few Tor nodes, and each Tor node advertised or published its public key. So the client, the user, there is an Onion Router node, but then there's also sort of there's software that you run in your machine, which is your interface to the Tor network. So a couple of nodes out of the cloud of available Tor Onion routers would be chosen, and their public keys would be gathered. The user then takes the payload that they want to put out anonymously on the internet, and by that I mean, a request for a page on a website somewhere, or a posting to a socially controversial site, or who knows what. Whatever it is they want to hide the origin as being themselves. They encrypt that with the last node that they're going to visit, the so-called exit node, where their data will finally leave the internet. Then they put on the so they encrypt that payload and sort of think of it as like sticking it into an envelope. or it's called an onion router because of layers of an onion. So you can think of it like maybe being a sphere, and you wrap it with encryption so that no one can get in. Then on the outside of that, you put the address of that node, that last node. Then you go to the node that will precede that one, the node that will be previous to that as you're sending stuff out. And again, you know what its public key is, so you use its public key to encrypt that sphere. And then on the outside of that, you put its address. And then you choose the third one. Maybe it's the first one you're going to send something to, and you encrypt what you have so far with its public key. Now you've got this multi-layered blob, and you send it to the first node. So first of all, that connection out to some random Tor node somewhere is encrypted under its public key, and only it has the matching private key. So no force on earth that we're aware of is able to access that. But even if someone did, it's still got, remember, 2 more layers of encryption in these nested layers of onion in order to actually get down to the payload. So
you're selling a lot of spin right today.
So what actually happens is that first node, since that the outer shell was encrypted with its public key, the first node to receive it is able to use its private key to essentially unwrap that layer, to decrypt that layer. Then what it finds is, remember, on the outside is the address of the next node. It can't decrypt the contents inside because only the next node has that. But on the outside is the address. So it sends this blob, which is still opaque to it, onto the second node. The second node receives it, and now the outer layer, it was encrypted with its public key. So it uses its matching private key to decrypt that layer, which exposes the address of the third node, and underneath that is the remaining encryption under that third node's public key. So it has no access to that either. And notice that second node, the one in the middle, it only knows that it got a blob from another onion router, but it has no knowledge of where that came from. That is, it doesn't know who sent it to that onion router. So this we're going to see the number 3 a lot, because that sort of seems to be like the sufficient number of nodes involved to create anonymity no matter which way you come at it and how you look at it. Because that second guy receives it from the first one, doesn't know who the first one received it from, and all it knows is to send it on to the third one. And then the third one, similarly, only knows that it received it from the second one, has no idea that whether it came from an individual or from another onion router, because all trace of the earlier hops have been removed. Those previous shells, if we look at it like a spherical onion, those shells have been decrypted and stripped off and removed, removing all trace of its history. And at no point along the way has anyone been able to see what this thing, have any of the intermediary nodes, onion router nodes, been able to see what this thing contains. Finally, it gets to the third hop, which was the first encryption done of the actual payload. So that final onion router decrypts it as only it's able to, because only it has its private key that matches the public key that it advertises. So it decrypts it, and now here's a standard internet packet, which it simply drops out on the internet. That is the so-called exit node from the Tor network, and the packet goes off, as packets do, bouncing around regular routers towards its destination. So that's the Tor system as it was. Now, there was a redesign to address some theoretical problems with this. There were various people who said, well, even if you couldn't encrypt the data, if you stored the data, then if at any future time it was ever possible to determine the private key from the past of an onion router, then, and if you happen to get the private keys associated with the paths that blob took, then you could decrypt it and obtain all the information. So what this system used to lack is something known as perfect forward secrecy. We've talked about what perfect forward secrecy is. It is this property that you should not be able to learn something in the future which allows you to go back into the past and obtain knowledge that the past wouldn't want you to have. So the system was re-engineered, and many other capabilities, including what we're about to discuss here, hidden services, occurred. So here's how this was re-engineered. Instead of the user in advance choosing the route that the payload is going to take and building up an onion and then just dropping it on to the first onion router and off it goes, the capabilities in the onion routers were increased. Notice that with what I just described, the original system, there was no state being maintained. There was no notion of connections or persistent state. That is, the onion router would just sort of sit there. It didn't have to have any history at all. And if a blob came in, it would see whether it was able to decrypt it using its private key. And if so, it would then send the blob on to the next jump in the router, or out onto the internet if it happened to be the last one to decrypt the innermost shell. No knowledge was necessary. This changed with the rewrite of Tor and this move to 2.0. Now what happens is that the user establishes a session with the first onion router node. It sends all the onion routers still broadcast a public key, but unlike the original system where that public key was used for encryption, and that was the weakness, instead we now use session keys that are established with a so-called Diffie-Hellman handshake. And we've talked about the way that works. That's the exponentiation approach, where anyone can observe the traffic going in both directions, but even the person observing it is unable to determine what the mutually agreed upon key is from looking at all of the dialogue back and forth. And this, for example, is an option now in SSL and TLS protocols, and very well established, very secure, very quick and lightweight too. So the client sends it gets the first onion router's public key, and it sends the first half of this Diffie-Hellman handshake encrypted under that first router's public key. So the first router receives that. It decrypts it and only it's able to, using its private key. And then it has the first half of this two-way handshake. It finishes the handshake, sends back the second half of the handshake to the client, and hashes the resulting session key and signs it with it. Okay, I'm sorry, I went a little fast. And so when it finishes the handshake, now it has the session key. Once the client receives that second half of the handshake, the client also will have the matching session key for the encryption. So to prove that the onion router also has it, the onion router hashes that key and then signs it with its private key, which only it has, and sends that packet back. So the client now receives that, which it believes came from the onion router that it's trying to establish a connection to. It decrypts that using that router's public key, which will only work if it was signed with the router's private key. That returns that finishes the handshake, allows it to establish the secret pseudo-random session key that they will be using to communicate henceforth, and it's able to verify that they both have the same session key by decrypting the hash of the key. So now we've got we've securely and with authentication of the onion router established a connection, sort of the first link. Now the client chooses another onion router on the network, but does not contact it directly. Instead, it uses the link that it's established to the first onion router to do exactly the same thing that it just did with the first one, essentially sort of virtually moving itself to the other side of that first link. So now the second link is similarly established between the first onion router and the second onion router, using exactly the same protocol, and then it moves itself out to the second onion router to establish a third link, and so on. Typically, as I said before, 3 links. So that's the approach used. It's still the case that the data is bouncing from one onion router to the next, and as a consequence of moving up this chain of links, a series of session keys has been created for encrypting each link, and that same session key is used for creating an onion wrapped packet, which is then sent down the link, and as it bounces, each session key is used to decrypt the successive layers. And since the session keys are ephemeral, as the term is, they're only used briefly for that connection. At no point in the future would compromise of a router's private key give anybody any information about how to decrypt data that was stored moving through moving through the onion router network. So that's the difference. It's subtle, but it's significant. And essentially what's been done is a more sophisticated protocol has been created. So what we have now is essentially what we had before. That is the ability for a user to hide themselves on the network. What we want is something new, which is the ability of services like websites, IRC chat servers, meeting areas, whatever, internet services that are traditionally always public, because the only way to reach them is over the public internet with an IP address. The gurus of Tor said, we could hide these. We could use the Tor system to allow people to publish public services, meaning available to anyone who uses Tor, so that the services were available from within the Tor network and not publicly. And the only way to get to them is through the Tor network, meaning that they do not have public IP addresses, and that no one using them can gain any knowledge of where they are, where they physically exist in the world, where they physically exist on the internet. So it's sort of a next generation evolution of Tor. The way it works is this. Somebody who wants to offer a service of any sort, any kind of internet service that anonymous users can access and that itself wants to remain anonymous, chooses 3 onion router nodes at random, just 3. And these are called introduction points. So we have introduction points are for a given service are 3 routers, 3 onion routers on the network. The service creates a long-term public key pair so that it can have a public key which is used within the network to identify its service. So this public key represents this service. The service establishes circuits, static circuits that continue to exist with each of these 3 introduction points. And we're using 3 for redundancy, so that if one was off the net for a while or disappeared, it would always be possible to pick a third one. But in the meantime, you'd like to have a way to get to the service. So 3 gives us redundancy. So it establishes a circuit to these introduction points using the new protocol I just explained, where it successive links that protect its identity. Notice that its identity is being protected now as a service in the same way that the user's identity was being protected as a client. So it establishes over 3 hops links to introduction points. So and it says, here is my public key for anybody who wants to access me. Let's keep this circuit open, and if anyone wants to access me, they will reference this public key. Then the service, in a Tor directory, publishes its public key and the identity of the 3 introduction points it has chosen. It signs that and encrypts it with its public key to give it authentication, and a 16-character token is statically created from that information, and that's what's known to the public. So the address of the service is this random 16-character token .onion. That's like the domain name within the Tor system. 16 characters that are derived from its directory entry .onion, in the same way that we have .org and .net and .com. So now, out of band, not using the Tor system at all, some user has been notified or heard that there's a service hiding within the Tor network, which is offers something that the user wants. So the client now, it uses its Tor interface to say, I want to connect to this service. And so it uses that funky 16-character token .onion in order to in order to initiate the connection. What it does is it goes to the Tor directory and uses that to look up the information it needs. It gets a one-time cookie, a so-called nonce, N-O-N-C-E, a nonce, which will represent itself just for the purpose of authentication. Now it chooses at random a node in the Tor network, which we call the rendezvous point. And so it opens a circuit, 3 hops out to a node, which is the so-called rendezvous point. And it connects to it, and it says, hey, I would like to rendezvous with this service. Here's the service's descriptor. Please set that up for me. So it establishes the rendezvous point and as the place where the service is going to connect. So 3 hops out to the rendezvous point. Then it connects to the introduction point, which are sort of like the 3 listening outposts for the service. And it says to the to the introduction point. Hi there, I'm waiting at the rendezvous point. Since you're representing the service, you're one of the 3 rendezvous points the service has chosen. Please notify the service of my interest in connecting to it, and I'll be over at the rendezvous point. So the introduction point that has one of those 3 introduction points that has this that static circuit up and connected to the service, it sends this information to the service along with that cookie, remember, that it's been given by the client. The service then is able to decide if it wishes to accept the connection. So this provides installation against any kind of denial of service attack or bandwidth flooding attack and so forth. Nothing is able to get to it directly. It essentially has to mutually agree with the client that it wants to offer the service. So if, assuming that it does, it then establishes a multi-hop circuit to the rendezvous point. So it'll have its 3 links, anonymizing it again to the rendezvous. It gets there, hands the rendezvous its agreement to connect along with the cookie, the pseudo-random cookie that the client gave. The rendezvous point forwards that to the client because the client has a connection to it, who was established first. The client receives back the cookie which it initially gave. That gives and there's wrappers of encryption on all of this, and that cookie was signed then before it was sent back, signed by the advertised service's private key, so that only its matching advertised public key is able to decrypt it, thus authenticating the fact that it has received the cookie back from the real service. Now, the client and the service both have mutually anonymizing multi-hop connections to the rendezvous router, and it passes traffic back and forth between them anonymously. And that's how the new system works.
Well, that was simple enough. I don't know why anybody would be at all confused by that.
So, backing off from this a little bit, essentially what this means, and I should say that the standard Tor client software, the software that people get from Tor to load on their computer to access the Tor network, it is the hidden service software. That is, it's the same package. So anybody who has a computer that wanted to publish information anonymously on the internet through Tor is able to use the same. It's not like you have to go get something secret or special or something somewhere. Everybody has it. So anyone can be a publisher and can essentially establish introduction points, publish their identity on the directory, and then arrange through some out-of-band means, on a mailing list or who knows where, or put it on some other website. Here's a service that we're offering at this funky address, and then people are able to connect to it. They're anonymous, and it's anonymous, and everything is encrypted from end to end. And it's done in a way that thwarts, everyone's best effort to attack this.
So this sounds like a big improvement.
It's a huge improvement. Yeah. It is. It's, you take sort of the original concept and implement it and then think about it.
Address the issues that we've mentioned many times with it.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
And do you feel this addresses those issues, the endpoint issues, things like that?
Yeah. The only thing that they're still, the only weakness that we know of is that it still wants to be fast. That is, it wants to send. Well, yes, it's certainly
it's kind of the nature of this because of the layers that it's going to be a little slower than direct.
Well, but here's the part: is that if it's not heavily used, then people monitoring traffic going in and out can associate, sort of statistically associate the the events of traffic entering and exiting this large cloud of onion routers, even though that's bouncing around for a while. I mean, still, if it's heavily used, then it becomes much less easy to disambiguate entry and exit events. Now, I mean, this is well known. So, for example, all it would have to do is introduce arbitrary delays in the forwarding of traffic from one onion router to the next. And then it would completely break the ability to use the temporal connectivity of traffic entering and exiting the cloud to associate those events. On the other hand, it would really make it slow. So they've said, no, that's not what we're going to do. The bigger the network is, the more Tor nodes there are, the more busy it becomes over time. They're recognizing that while it's in its infancy with a few nodes and not much traffic, it's easier to associate incoming and outgoing events. Even though the incoming events are encrypted and the outgoing events are encrypted if they're going out to a hidden service. But still, they're
likely to be related statistically.
Yes,
if there's not a lot
the
of
relationship of them statistically is the concern. They've said, look, that's not the problem we're solving. We're going to make the more nodes there are, the more popular the network is, the more use it sees, the less feasible. Oh, and notice too, in order to make the statistical process work, you really need to monitor all the nodes. Well, they're also geographically diverse. They're all over the globe now. So it makes it very difficult for any single entity to have network-level access to the entire Tor node network. I mean, many of them are deliberately in obscure locations. So anyway, my sense is if I were to hook up to Tor and do something through it, there's kind of a coolness factor. It's like, oh, wow, I'm, no one can find me. It's like, well, okay, that's never a problem that I have.
People can find you.
But they know where I am. But there's sort of a coolness factor to it.
Well, and Tor Mail is probably the best example of a hidden service. I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago.
It's a perfect example.
And that's one where speed is not an issue.
Right.
And it's a hidden service. So, in fact, if you go to the tormail.org page, it says, this is just an informational page. None of Tor Mail systems are hosted here or on any server you can find the IP address. Seizing or shutting down this website will have no effect on Tor Mail services.
Very cool.
Yeah. I mean, go ahead, find us.
That's perfect.
Yeah. I think that's a very good example of using a hidden service in Tor.
Yeah, and one of the takeaways from this is for everyone who just completely glazed over and wished they were listening to Liquid Mind for the last 15 minutes rather than me, or their mind has been liquefied.
I have a liquid mind.
Jellified. Look at what it takes to create anonymity. That's how non-anonymous the internet is. Yeah. They didn't do this just because they were bored one afternoon. I mean, it takes that much in order to truly anonymize the internet. So anyone who's thinking, oh, no one knows who I am, is like, oh, because they don't care. But anyone who cared would absolutely know who you were. And so I think this is an interesting lesson, is that this is what it takes. All of that rigmarole in order to truly protect identities on the internet. And even then, if the data that you send gives away who you are, well, then you're not anonymous anymore.
And you were worried about tracking cookies, Steve. I had to throw that in. Steve Gibson is the guy at grc.com, the Gibson Research Corporation. That's how you can find him on the internet. You can also follow him on the Twitter, SGGRC. Now, if you go there, you'll find a lot of free stuff like his great Shields Up service. But don't forget his bread and butter, the yabba dabba doos you hear in the background, all come from one and only one thing, and that's SpinRite, the world's best hard drive maintenance utility. You got to have it if you have a hard drive. So
and
pick up a
from
copy.
Many of our really great listeners, Leo, who have just really been, supporting me and my efforts and my ability to do this and offer all this stuff.
We're so pleased.
For free.
Yeah.
It comes all from SpinRite.
Steve does, on his own, make 16 kilobit versions available of the show, audio. So it's that's a very small file. He also does transcripts, the smallest file of all, human typed, actual legible transcripts of each and every show. Both of those.
Elaine researches them. I mean, every single thing I mentioned, she goes and makes sure that it's spelled right. And
I'll give you an example. I almost can guarantee you, if you're looking at the transcript right now, Tor is spelled capital T, lowercase o-r.
I promise.
Because she figured it out, right?
Yep.
That's how good she is, Elaine. Good job. And if it's not, well, she's going out and fixing it right now with the global search and replace.
She listens to this too.
Well, of course she has to. She's typing it.
That's right.
Yeah. And by the way, you can watch this show live. We do it live every Wednesday, 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern time. I almost had to punt today because my son Henry's giving his senior speech right about now. And I was just either going to leave or have Ayaz do the show, but it turns he moved it to Monday. Thank goodness. So I can go see his senior speech.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
And he's really come together, hasn't he?
Yeah, he has. He's
Yay.
He's waiting. He got into Arizona State. He's waiting to hear from Cal State Chico and Colorado University Boulder. CU Boulder.
You don't want him to go to Chico.
They're both party schools. I said,
Yeah.
Henry, is it a coincidence that you picked the two biggest party schools in the United States? He said, they are? I said, yes, they are. But you know what? Any college in the U.S. is a party school on a Saturday night, so I don't know if it makes any difference.
True.
I mean, if you want a party, you'll find a party. But ASU is a great school. You know, that's where Lawrence Krauss teaches, and he's interested in music, so he's applied to schools that have good music programs.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. Any event, I got a little sidetracked. You watch the show 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern time. That would be 1900 UTC, and it's great to have you live. We the people in the chat room, we all chat together as it's going on. But if you can't watch live, as I mentioned, on-demand versions available at Steve's site, and we have a higher quality audio as well as video at twit.tv/SN. Security Now, twit.tv/SN. And, of course, you can always get a copy wherever finer network internet broadcasts are aggregated and served. I guess that's it. Next week, Q&A. So do go to grc.com/feedback if you have questions about security, privacy, or any of the things we talk about on the show. And Steve will answer 10 of them next week.
I'll read them, and we'll be back in a week.
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Leo.
Security Now.